Hello, welcome back. Today we are reading chapter 9 of C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's called Into the Witch's House. You might remember that last time we were reading, Edmund had snuck away from the Beavers and from his brother and sisters during dinner, and they are sure that he is headed to the witch's house. And I've been very worried, wondering what in the world might be happening to him. So let's read and find out what happens in the witch's house. And now, of course, you're going to want to know what has happened to Edmund. He hadn't eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking all the time about Turkish delight. And there's nothing that spoils the taste of good ordinary food half as much as the memory of bad magic food. And he had heard the conversation and hadn't enjoyed it much either, because he kept on thinking that the others were taking no notice of him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. They weren't, but he imagined it. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan, and until he had heard the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table. It was then that he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door. For the mention of Aslan had given him a mysterious and kind of horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had repeating the rhyme about Adam's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle. And just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling him that the White Witch wasn't really human at all, but half a djinn and half a giantess, Edmund had got outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him. You mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brothers and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish delight, and to be a prince, and later a king, and to pay Peter out for calling him a beast. As for what the witch would do with the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them. Certainly not to put them on the same level as himself, of course. But he managed to believe, or to pretend that he believed, that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't true. She was jolly nice to me, anyway, much nicer than they are, and I expect she is the rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least, that was the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside him, he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. I wonder how he knew that. Have you ever been in this situation where you're kind of like, that's not a smart idea, and you don't know why you know it? I think that might be what Edmund is feeling right now. But he's a little worried, but he doesn't want to admit it. The first thing he realized when he got outside and found the snow falling all around him was that he had left his coat behind in the Beaver's house. And, of course, there was no chance of going back to get it now. The next thing he realized was that the daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down to dinner, and the winter days were short. He hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best of it. So he turned up his collar, and he shuffled across the top of the dam. Luckily, it wasn't so slippery since the snow had fallen, and he went to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad, actually, when he got to the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and what with that and the snowflakes swirling all around him, he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then, too, there was no road, and he kept slipping into deep drifts of snow, and skidding on frozen puddles, and tripping over fallen tree trunks, and sliding down steep banks, and barking his shin against rocks, till he was wet and cold and bruised all over. The silence and the loneliness were dreadful. In fact, I really think he might have given up the whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends with the other if he hadn't happened to say to himself, "When I'm the king of Narnia, the first thing I shall do will be to make some decent roads." And, of course, that set him off thinking about being a king and all the other things he would do, and this cheered him up a good deal. He had just settled in his mind what sort of palace he would have, and how many cars, and all about his private movie theater, and where the railroads would run, and what laws he would make against beavers and dams, and was putting the finishing touches to some schemes he had for putting his big brother Peter in his place, when the weather changed. First, the snow stopped. Then a wind sprang up and became freezing cold. Finally, the clouds rolled away and the moon came out. It was a full moon, and shining on all that new snow, it made everything almost as bright as daytime. Only the shadows were very confusing. He would never have found his way if the moon hadn't come out by the time he got to the other river. You remember he had seen that other river when they first arrived at the beavers? It was a smaller river flowing into the great one, but only lower down. He now reached this, and he turned to follow it up. But the little valley down from where it had come was much steeper and rockier than the one he had just left, and it was very overgrown with bushes, so that he could not have managed it at all in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet through, for he had to stoop to go under branches and get loads of snow that were falling off of the trees and onto his back. And every time this happened, he thought more and more of how much he hated Peter, just as if this had all been Peter's fault. Was it really Peter's fault that the snow was falling on him? No. But at last he came to a part where it was more level and the valley opened out, and there, on the other side of the river, quite close to him, in the middle of a little plain between two hills, he saw what must be the White Witch's house, and the moon was shining brighter than ever. The house was really a small castle. It seemed to be all towers, little towers with long pointed spires on them, sharp as needles. They looked like huge dunces' caps or sorcerers' caps, and they shone in the moonlight, and their long shadows looked strange on the snow. Edmund began to be afraid of the house, but it was too late to think of turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring or moving around, not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on and on, past corner after corner of the house, and past turret after turret to find the door. He had to go right round to the far side before he found it. It was a huge arch, but the great iron gates stood wide open. Edmund crept up to the arch and looked inside into the courtyard, and there he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as if it were ready to spring at him. And Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on and afraid to go back, with his knees knocking together in fright. He stood there so long that his teeth would have been chattering with cold if they had not been chattering already from his fear. How long this really lasted, I don't know, but it seemed to Edmund to last for hours. Then at last he began to wonder why the lion was standing so still, for it hadn't moved 1 inch since he first set eyes on it. Edmund now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadow of the arch as much as he could. He now saw from the way the lion was standing that it couldn't have been looking at him at all. But supposing it turned its head, thought Edmund. In fact, it was staring at something else. Namely, it was staring at a little dwarf who stood with his back to it about 4 feet away. Aha! thought Edmund. When it springs at the dwarf, then will be my chance to escape. But still, the lion never moved. Neither did the dwarf. And now at last, Edmund remembered what the others had said about the White Witch turning people into stone. Perhaps this was only a stone lion. Do you think it's a statue? It hasn't moved. Let's see. And as soon as Edmund had thought of that, he noticed that the lion's back and the top of its head were covered with snow. Of course it must be only a statue. No living animal would have let itself get covered with snow. Then, very slowly, and with his heart beating as if it might burst, Edmund ventured up toward the lion. Even now, he hardly dared to touch it. But at last, he put out his hand very quickly, and he did. It was cold stone. He had been frightened of a mere statue. Whew! At least he wasn't about to get eaten by a lion. The relief which Edmund felt was so great that even though he was cold, he suddenly got warm all over, right down to his toes, and at the same time there came into his head what seemed a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is that great lion Aslan that they were all talking about. She's caught him already and turned him into stone. So that's the end of all their fine ideas about him. Ha! Who's afraid of Aslan? And he stood there gloating over the stone lion, and presently he did something very silly and childish. He took a stump of pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a mustache on the lion's upper lip, and then a pair of spectacles around the lion's eyes. And then he said, "Ha! Silly old Aslan! How do you like being a stone? You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you?" I need a little drink. I've been making all those voices. Sorry about that. You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you? But in spite of the scribbles on the face of the great stone beast, it still looked so terrible and sad and noble, staring up into the moonlight, that Edmund didn't really get any fun out of making fun of it. So he turned away, and he began to cross the courtyard. As he got into the middle of it, he saw that there were actually dozens of statues all around him. They were standing here and there, rather as the pieces stand on a chessboard when the game is halfway through. There were stone satyrs, and stone wolves, and bears, and foxes, and cat mountains of stone. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but who are really the spirits of trees. Those are dryads. There was the great shape of a centaur, and a winged horse, and a long, lithe creature that Edmund took to be a dragon of some sort. They all looked so strange standing there, perfectly lifelike, but also perfectly still, in the bright, cold moonlight, that it was very eerie work crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape like a man, but as tall as a tree, with a fierce face, and a shaggy beard, and a great big club in its right hand. Even though he knew it was only a stone giant, and not a live one, Edmund did not like going past it. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from a doorway on the far side of the courtyard. He went to it. There was a flight of stone steps going up to an open door. Edmund went up to them. across the threshold there lay a great wolf. "It's all right, it's all right," he kept saying to himself. "It's only a stone wolf. It can't hurt me." And he raised his leg to step over it. Instantly, the huge creature rose with all the hair bristling along its back, opened a great red mouth, and said in a growling voice, "Who's there? Who's there? Stand still, stranger, and tell me who you are." If, if you please, sir," said Edmund, trembling so that he could hardly speak. My name is Edmund, and I'm the son of Adam that Majesty met with the other day, and I've come to bring her the news that my brother and sisters are now in Narnia, quite close. They're in the beaver's house. She wanted to see them." "I will tell her Majesty. Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold, if you value your life." And then it vanished into the house. Woo! Whew! That was a real wolf. It must be the Queen's guard. It's a good thing it didn't just attack Edmund, or he'd be all over. I don't think a giant wolf and Edmund would have been a good match for a fight. What do you think's going to happen? Do you think the Queen is going to be happy that Edmund's there? I just don't know. Let's find out. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold. His heart was pounding in his chest. And presently the grey wolf, whose name was Fenris Ulf, the chief of the witches' secret police, came bounding back and said, come in, fortunate favourite of the Queen, or else not so fortunate." Oh, fortunate favourite. Oh, good. That means Edmund's got some good luck. He's not going to get attacked right now. Ooh, that wolf's voice is hard to make. I'm glad I brought myself a nice warm cup of coffee. So Edmund went in, and he was very careful not to step on the wolf's paws as he walked by. He found himself in a long but gloomy hall with many pillars, full, as the courtyard had been, of statues. The one nearest the door was a little fawn with a very sad expression on its face, and Edmund couldn't help wondering if this might be Lucy's friend. The only light came from a single lamp, and close behind this sat the White Witch. "I've come, your Majesty," said Edmund, rushing eagerly forward. "How dare you come alone?" said the White Witch in a terrible voice. "Did I not tell you to bring the others with you?" "But, your Majesty, I've done the best I can. I've brought them quite close. They're in a little house on top of the dam just up the river with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver." A slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. "Is this all your news?" she asked. "No, your Majesty," said Edmund, and he proceeded to tell her all he had heard before leaving the beaver's house. "What? Aslan?" cried the Queen. "Aslan, is this true? If I find you have lied to me—" "Please, I'm only repeating what was said," stammered Edmund. But the Queen, who was actually no longer paying any attention to him, clapped her hands together. Instantly, the same dwarf whom Edmund had seen with her before appeared. "Make ready our sledge," ordered the Queen, "and use the harness that doesn't have bells." Why do you think she wants her sleigh to have no bells on it? I'm not sure, but I think we'll find out when we read our next chapter. I'm not going to tell you the name of the chapter, though, because it's such an exciting... Well, I don't know. Maybe I should. Chapter 10 is called "The Spell Begins to Break." That makes me very excited because I think some very good things might be happening But I don't know. I could be wrong. What do you think might happen? What spells might break? What's been going on? Oh, there's so many things. We're getting close to the climax of the book. That means like the big event. I love this book so much. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am, because I haven't read it in a long time and I'm very happy. So that's our chapter for today, and I will see you again tomorrow with chapter 10. Have a great one.